My grandfather was raised in the rural South and very impoverished portion of South Carolina during Reconstruction. And he, like a lot of people, wanted what he didn't have, and that's a generational thing. And growing up in such dire poverty with illiteracy and a total lack of culture, what he aspired to be was a cultivated man. And he wanted education, and he wanted cultivation. And he attended a one-room schoolhouse and ultimately was able to leave the family farm and put himself through college working as a telegrapher for the railroad, and he became a physician. He practiced in Richmond, Virginia. And he made it a continuing mission in life to read and to continue to expand his level of sophistication. He read all of Shakespeare. He memorized long portions of it. You know, he could quote Shakespeare and so forth. And the other thing he did is he developed an interest in music. And he I'm not sure how he got introduced to the violin, but he began to play the violin as a young man. And he played primarily classical music, a lot of it very romantic music of the era, which was very popular at that time. But he would play the violin and be accompanied by maybe a viola and a cello and a piano. And that was their idea of a wonderful Sunday afternoon would be to invite several musicians into the home and they would play music. And he, for a short stint after he returned to Richmond, played for the Richmond Symphony. I mean, he didn't have a major part. He was like second violin or something. But it was very important for him to move in those circles and to develop the sophistication and the skill to be a good musician. And at some point in his career, somebody kind of teased him with the idea of making his own violin. And so he did. He got a shop going in his basement, and his only real avocation or his only hobby that I can recall was violin making. And his basement always smelled of lacquer. You know, the basement had a very distinct smell when I would go down there, and that was all associated with making violins. You know, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine and the various finishes he put on violins. And he always had 6 or 8 violins that were drying somewhere. And in his lifetime, he made 71 violins. It took him about 6 months to make a violin, but he was always working on one. And he gave many of these violins away, and it was always to a promising student, somebody who had some musical promise, but who promised they would take classical instruction, okay, if he gave him a violin. So he managed to give away almost all of his violins, and he retained about 2. And about the time I was 18 or 19 years old, I got a lot better acquainted with my grandfather because I lived in Richmond, and I would see him frequently. And I began to go back into his little study, and he had 2 violins hanging in there. And I would get one of them out, and I would just practice drawing the bow across this violin. And I was messing around with it, and he realized that I was able to get some tone out of the violin, that I could draw the bow across the strings in a steady manner and not make the thing screech. And I persisted in messing around with that violin enough that he finally gave it to me with the promise that if I was that interested in violin, that I would take lessons and I would stick with it. And so I took up the violin, and I did take some classical instruction here for a while. I did that for 2 summers while I was working summer jobs between college and medical school. I would play the violin, and I was doing primarily classical music. And in fact, on several occasions, I played some classical duets with my grandfather. We'd go into the kitchen where they had a lot of reflective ceramic tile, you know, that would magnify the sound, and he and I would stand in there and play duets from paper, you know, in other words, from manuscripted. And that was kind of a thrill. But the problem about playing the violin is that if you're living with somebody, you have a roommate in college, they're not necessarily very encouraging. particularly if you're in the infancy of your playing. And at some point, after I'd begun college, my grandfather died, and I put the violin away. And it's not that I lost interest, but I just didn't have enough encouragement or internal motivation to play it. And my grandfather, one thing he stressed is that you need a hobby. And I was going to the Medical College of Virginia, which is also in Richmond, and I was in medical school. And I was just about as stressed out as I could be. I'd reached a point in my medical school career of real personal crisis because the work was truly getting to me mentally. And as it turned out, I was living in the Fan, and I was on my way back from the library one night, and I was going to my rented residence in the Fan, and I passed by this elementary school, and I heard all this music. And there were people playing string band music in there, and they were having a dance. And they did this every Wednesday night. So I kind of wandered in there off the street, because it was an open school. And they were having this dance in the gym. And I listened to the music, and I was really taken with string band music. I mean, I immediately heard it and knew that I wanted to be able to play that kind of music. And so I went back and I got my violin out, and I became acquainted with some of the fiddlers in Richmond. And the way I dealt with the privacy issue of practice is I would go over to my grandmother's house where my grandfather and she had resided, and I would go down to the basement where he made violins. And this is, 4 or 5, 6 years after his death. And I would sit down in the basement, and I could still smell the varnish from these violins. And I would sit down there and just saw on that thing and make all kinds of racket and play down there where nobody could hear me. And I got reacquainted with the fiddle down there in his shop, and that led to sort of a lifelong interest in playing the violin. Now, I've got to say that I'm not playing it exactly the way my grandfather would necessarily approve. Having come out of South Carolina and the poverty of that region, he did not really romanticize rural life. And I know that back in the 20s and 30s, I think the Carter family and people like that, the rural string bands of Virginia, would come to Richmond and play on the radio stations. And my grandfather absolutely abhorred that kind of music. So I'm sure if he could hear what I'm playing now, he'd probably be spinning in his grave. But, I have taken it to heart that I need a hobby. And it's through his violin playing and his interest in violin and the fact that he gave me an instrument that I've been able to develop this outlet, which has provided a great deal of satisfaction to me. And this interest in violin, this outlet, this recreation, this place I can go for inner peace, has probably enabled me to continue to practice as a physician, and which incidentally is what he was doing too.